Thus far in our course, we've looked at theories of magic. We looked at magic in the ancient and Indian world, and we've looked at magic amongst the Azandi in the early 20th century. We are shooting forward now into modern rural France, in fact, to look at an ethnography that was performed in the 1970s. Now, Jean Favret-Saada's book, it's probably the hardest book you're going to read in this class. And the first time I taught it, I thought my students were going to be like, no, never use it again. But then came around and kind of quite liked it as it passed on. And even when I've taught it online, I thought for sure people would be like, I don't like this book. But then they would write to me and say, I didn't like that book either. But then I ended up really liking it. You should keep using it. So I've kept using it. I think this is one of the many books that I've read that have made a huge impression on me and my thinking about magic. Why is it difficult? Well, Favret-Saada is a very careful thinker. As a writer, she's a little opaque. If you look at the French, it's a little clearer, but not a lot clearer. But I think some of the writing style in this is what has made this study just such a classic piece, such a piece that we really do consider a great work of literature across disciplines. So today, witchcraft and rural France, the ethnographer and the witchcraft system. So we're going to be looking at rural France in an area called the Bocage. And there's a picture of it here on the left. It's known for having hedges. Bocage means something like hedges and like wall and very low walls. So it's an area in the countryside that's very much, sort of squared off into these little sort of plots. And within one of these plots is where we're going to see a whole lot of witchcraft going on. Okay, let's get going. So who is Jean Favret-Saada? Well, she's a Jewish French scholar born in 1934. She taught in Algiers, the French colony area, before her academic work. The book we're reading today, Deadly Words, was a big deal when it was published in the late 70s and early 80s. And once it was translated, it got read all over the place. So this book, the work of Favret-Saada and Evans Pritchard, are kind of the most important anthropological studies on witchcraft. They're also brilliant ethnographies, brilliant recordings of interactions with people. So Evans Pritchard established a profound ethnographic method, and he was generous toward his subjects. He got in and lived their lives with them. Favret-Saada does this as well, except she takes the participant observer method even further than Evans Pritchard does. He blah, blah, blah. So she sort of figures out that there's no way to learn about witchcraft if one is not implicated in witchcraft, if one is not involved in it. There would be no way to go to the Bocage and find your way into this system without becoming bewitched yourself. And in fact, she does become bewitched herself, which is kind of thrilling about this story. The first time I heard about this book was in an African religions class, and my professor mentioned it, and they said, yeah, it's really wild. There's this woman doing an ethnography on witchcraft, and then she gets bewitched and has a whole bunch of car accidents and has to leave the field, which is kind of fascinating. We don't often see an ethnographer be just quite so clear about her life and her struggles and being just so into the culture that she's dealing with. All right, so witchcraft here is not about spells or stories. It's about relationships. There are some major relationships that we're going to go over a couple of times and see this all worked out. First is the victim. Witchcraft requires someone to have an ill sense, to have a pattern of horrible things happening, a pattern of like depression, or drunkenness, or all sorts of, just a repetitive pattern that's thought to be the result of a loss of force, of personal force and vitality. We'll get into that more. Then there needs to be a person who is not the person bewitched and is not an unwitcher who declares the person to be bewitched and under the influence of witchcraft. This person, Favret-Saada calls the annunciator. Finally, you have the anti-witcher, who is an unwitcher. She fights the witch, disrupting the power dynamic by which the witch has been stealing the vital energies of the bewitched victim in order to indeed go back against him and steal his own vital energies, ultimately killing the witch himself. Now, there is another problem, just like amongst the Azandi, there are no witches. There are witch accusations, but there are no witches. The original of the title of this book is Le mot, la mort, le sort, l'associé dans la Bocage. So that translates something like words, death, spells. So that really stresses words and death and how kind of violent of an order this is. Hence the translation, Deadly Words. So witchcraft and anti-witchcraft are about language and speech acts. Now, what's a speech act? As it's laid out in linguistics and in philosophy, a speech act doesn't communicate, it does something. For example, when a judge says, I pronounce you guilty, you're guilty, you go to jail, you pay a fine. When a religious authority declares you man and wife, you've changed. Your status has completely changed. You are something new. Now, a priest says, I absolve you of your sins, or this is the body of God in communion, and that does something. It's more than just communicating. So when this enunciator, the person who diagnoses the witchcraft, declares that a person suffers from witchcraft, from then on, that person is in the witchcraft world with cycles of events and misfortunes that are now attributed to the work of a witch. They may also, hopefully, work with an unwitcher who analyzes the person and their personal feelings and events, but then ritually battles the witch, also using words and spells. And hopefully the death causes the death of the person who was declared a witch. Just like in Evans Pritchard, there are no witches. Favret-Saada seeks an active witch. She's looking to actually find somebody who's doing this stuff. And she looks to find books of spells, because all the witches are said to have these books of spells. She cannot find these books. She researches sort of Western grimoires, European books of spells, and realizes they don't resemble what she sees going on in witchcraft lore, nor can she find anyone in the bocage where she's working who actually has any of these grimoires. So they're not there. However, thinking about Evans, Pritchard, and Favret-Saada, Favret-Saada on page 10 notes that when she was reading in the unabridged 1,000-word or 1,000-page version of Evans Pritchard work, which we read the abridgment of, she notices that in fact Evans Pritchard had been granted in that society the status of prince without portfolio. So he was effectively like a noble person. So only a normal person can't bewitch a noble. Only another noble can. And he's living kind of out in the middle of nowhere, not near the nobles. So he's basically de facto immune to witchcraft. He has an unstated position in which he is immune. Favret-Saada does not have that position. She was considered when she first went to have sort of like strong blood to be able to engage witchcraft so much, but not be caught. That strength was thought to protect her until it doesn't. And when she is caught, when she is bewitched, she leans in. She steers hard into the turn. And once she's caught, then all sorts of people tell her about the dynamics of witchcraft that she could not figure out before. Favret-Saada is declared to be bewitched, as I said, when she is caught. And throughout the book, she will explore this dynamic while also being within the dynamic. She works with an unwitcher, and she also has people that come to her seeing how much she knows about witchcraft, asking her to become an unwitcher for them. As the fieldwork continues, she finds herself increasingly unstable, coming to believe that she herself is truly bewitched. Eventually, after a series of car accidents and illnesses, she left the field for months, went back to Paris to get her head straight. But she really didn't want to go back. She didn't want to be back in that place. So she goes back into the field and very quickly just wraps everything off and then just gets out. So this is not something an ethnographer would usually do. The witchcraft has an effect on her. She's supposed to be an objective scientist and anthropologist recording culture, but she herself is in the culture and is affected by the culture. By being caught and working in the system, she, in herself, actually perpetuates the system. She makes witchcraft even more powerful by being involved in it. And then she actually asks herself, which I find really interesting, why does she want to know all this about witchcraft? What causes her to want to be involved like this? And what causes her to go beyond just merely learning the basics of the system, writing a paper, and getting lost? Well, one, she can't learn about the system without being in it. She realized that. Two, there is no accounting for taste. You never know why you're going to be interested in some things. Taste is a lot of it. I mean, why do I study magic? Is she a bad person for wanting to know about witchcraft and thereby learning about it, perpetuating it? Maybe, maybe not. Am I a bad person for studying magic? Who knows? The book was published in the late 70s, and the translation came out in the 1980s. The translator, Catherine Cullen, writes this note about the translation, which this is really interesting to me. This book is long quotations of peasant dialogues in the regional dialect. In agreement with the author, I have chosen to translate these into standard English and not into some rural English dialect. It seemed preferable to give up some of the local flavor rather than instill an arbitrarily chosen one. So they decide to just write in and translate in standard English what would be sort of a very rural dialect. I mean, imagine if she had written this to get the rural sense of it with someone having like an Iowa accent or a Southern accent. So that would be kind of odd. So Favret-Saada and her work gained wide renown, and she became very popular in the academic communities, but also was interviewed widely in print and TV media. That said, she never wrote another book that was as popular. She wrote a book about religious blessings and blasphemies in the 1980s. Her follow-up book is called The Anti-Witch, and it was translated and published in 2015 in English. I've got a copy of it. It's really interesting, but it's not as good and groundbreaking and intricate and as well argued as this book is. She has written a wide range of articles, and she remains an important figure in the field of anthropology, especially in Europe. All right, take a break, get a cup of coffee, do a little dance, do some yoga, whatever you need to do, and then come back and watch the next video. I'll see you in the next one on the other side of this break.